Achoo! Hey, what's up, people? It has been a minute, right? So, um, yeah, this video, I am not talking about this knife. I'm just playing with this knife. But I want to talk about. I wish I knew these things when I was getting into knives. And this is the second part. In the first part, I talked about geometry. Basically, I give you a summary if you haven't seen that video. I said that geometry is more important than steel. What I mean by that is if you have two knives and they are exactly the same steel with the same heat treatment, and you have one knife that's thick on the spine and thicker in the grind, thicker behind the edge, it's not going to cut as long, meaning it has less edge retention than the same knife with the same steel, but thinner on the spine, thinner in the grind, and thinner behind the edge. So geometry is more important than steel. That's what I said in the first part, and that's I still think that's true. So, but still, I want to get a little bit into the opinions that I have about steels today, and I also want to mention that this is not. We are not gonna talk about every steel and everything. This is such a complex topic, and I have oversimplified this whole topic to make it easier to understand, to make it a little bit more fun to watch, and I think this will help a lot of people that are new into knives, but by no means this is a discussion about all the steels. We are not gonna talk about tool steels and carbon chromium steels and all that stuff. I have simplified it a little bit for the time we are in right now, and what I mean by that is right now I think we are in a time where people try to look for easy answers, and they are like, okay, what's the best steel? They go on YouTube and find these big YouTube channels that say this is the best steel, and then like, okay, great, this is the best steel. For instance, I have two Microtech SOCOMs here, and this is an old one, and this is the one that is currently in production. So this is two generations of Microtech SOCOM ago. So basically there was this one, then there was another one, and then there was this version right here. And as you can see, this knife right here is in 154 cm. Hopefully that shows on camera. It's in 154 cm, and that one is in M390. So people will look at these knives and they are like, okay, this one is M390, so this one is the better steel, right? The better knife automatically. Which I wouldn't say that's true, because if we flip those knives over, you can see this knife is really thick on the spine. This one is thin on the spine. This one is 5 millimeters on the spine, and this one is 3.5 millimeters or 3.6 millimeters on the spine. So this one is a lot thinner. It's also thinner, therefore, in the grind and behind the edge, in its geometry, basically, than this knife. So even though this has M390, this knife right here outperforms this one any day of the week, even though it's just, quote, just 154 cm. But the geometries on this knife are just so much better that it also cuts better. It also performs better. By the way, this knife right here is 19 years old, and look at the blade centering on a 19-year-old Microtech SOCOM. That's amazing. I don't know about you guys, but for a knife that's this old, that's pretty good. So, but just wanted to say that just because it says this is a certain steel doesn't mean that this steel is automatically bad or good. You have to look into more things. So for instance, in this knife with the thick spine, the edge is decently thin on this knife actually, but because the spine is thick and the edge is thin, you get that kind of geometry behind the edge, or in general at the blade and cross section. We have a wedgy geometry, whereas you have a thin spine and a thin edge, you get this kind of geometry. Now, obviously, this geometry doesn't cut as well as this geometry. So the steel, it doesn't matter which steel it is, the geometry has to unlock what the steel can do. Meaning, for instance, this knife is built like a tank, it's built like an off-road truck, but it uses the engine of a race car. That engine will never come to its full potential. This M390 in this steel will never come to its full potential because of the geometries used in this knife. And for instance, you have a Chebokov knife. I mean, that knife is a little bit more expensive, but this knife also uses M390 and is thin on the spine and super scary thin behind the edge. It's like 0.2 millimeters or something like that. So really scary thin. This knife is set up for slicing, it's set up for cutting. Therefore, the steel with the edge retention makes a lot more sense in this blade than in this one. So, like I said, the geometry unlocks what the steel can do. So, don't just look at the steel and say, okay, this is a good steel, this is a bad steel. The geometry is the important stuff. So now that we have clarified that there is more that goes into a knife than just the steel itself, I also want to point out that steel is not necessarily steel. If you have a maker that gives you that thinner grind and that higher hardness, and that also takes more time to do the heat treatment right, you're gonna get ultimately a better result in the cutting performance. So one maker heat treats M390 this way and the other one heat treats it completely different. So that means, like I said, just because you have the same steel, the knives are gonna perform completely different. Also, a lot of people, they put more time into machining and they have to put a lot of cost and effort into machining stuff out in their knives. So a lot of money goes into that, and they may not have as much money left over to put in the heat treatment process, which is, it's always a trade-off of that. If you have a knife that's more complicated to build, you may not be able to put in the best steel that you possibly can. And also, we see a lot of makers being not comfortable with the steels they use, because how the market works is people demand a certain steel, they have certain expectations. Everybody wants the M390 now, everybody wants the D2 in budget knives. Nobody is fine with AUS 8 anymore, nobody likes 8013 MOV anymore. So the pressure that certain companies have gets higher and higher and higher, which is why we see companies like Microtech putting an M390 in their knives. That does not really work. This is really wacky M390. It got dull after a week of use, not even that. This is not a great steel. This is not a well heat treated M390, and the reason we see that is because they are not comfortable working with that stuff yet, which is also the reason why I'm saying sometimes it would be better if we would let companies work with the steels they're comfortable with, because I would rather have a well heat treated 154 cm than a bad heat treated M390, because if the steel is not heat treated well, what's the point of even using it, right? Just to have that little number on here, that number is not going to do anything for you. The heat treatment geometry is going to do something for you in the end. I'm not hating on Microtech, by the way. There are so many companies that do that. We see it with Lion Steel, Zero Tolerance, all the big names basically. They are not comfortable with working with every steel yet, and that's just how it is. Also, we can see that there is an increase in as the longer a steel is on the market, the better people get at heat treating it, which is just logical in the end. Spyderco's S40V, when it came out, was way chippier in my experience than it is now. So my older Spydercos in S40V, they perform a little bit different than my newer Spydercos in S40V. So I do believe that they have gotten a little bit better with the heat treatment. They have gotten more comfortable with the steel. They now know what to expect, and they have probably also listened to customers' feedback, and their own experiences also played a role in how they treat it differently now. And also, other companies, like I said, they do it different. Buck's S40V has a lot more edge retention than Spyderco's S40V, but they're very similar in terms of edge toughness, edge impact resistance. Those things also play a role, so I wouldn't always look into what steel necessarily has the best edge retention, because edge retention is just one part of many attributes that a steel has. There's also the attribute of resharpenability, the ability to take a nice clean edge, the ability to hold a fine edge better. For instance, non-powdered steels, and you can try that for yourself. Take two knives, one in a powdered steel and one in a non-powdered steel, and resharpen that to a razor sharp edge, and then cut with both of them and see which one holds the razor sharp edge longer. And you're gonna notice that non-powdered steels usually hold a fine razor sharpness better and longer than any powdered steels. But powdered steels, on the other hand, they hold their sharpness in total a little bit longer, meaning they hold a bad edge longer, and non-powdered steels hold a fine edge longer, but the entire edge retention is less. So if that makes sense to you. Aus 8 is a steel that is looked down upon a lot, because I'm just saying this because I have a Aus 8 knife here in my hand, which is not fair at all. Because, but I do understand, because people are used to knives. If I would base my opinion on Aus 8 on this knife alone, I would hate Aus 8 as a steel. I would absolutely hate it. But because I have experienced different knives in Aus 8, I can say that I actually do like it. It has its benefits. But certain companies are not doing the heat treatment right, not doing the grinds right. They just give you a bad impression of what that steel can ultimately be. I think the benefits of something like Aus 8 is that you can restrop it and maintain it pretty easily in the field. And that is also true for Spyderco's VG10, for instance. But Spyderco's VG10 is not the hardest. It tends to roll over a little bit more easy to each side, but that means I can restrop it in the field, on my pant leg, on the corner of a table, on my leather belt. I can do all those things that I can't do with other steels or other knives that use the same steel, for instance, but they are a little bit harder heat treated. If you want a good VG10, SOG used to do really good VG10, and Kaiser also does pretty good VG10 in terms of edge retention, but it's a little bit more, it takes a little bit more to maintain that steel, but it's still not very difficult. So there are some benefits of powdered steels and non-powdered steels, and I think a lot of people need to be a little bit less picky when it comes to steels in general. If you think about budget knives, everybody wants a D2 in a budget knife these days, and I do get that. You certainly do get more edge retention out of D2 steel. Again, it depends on how it is treated and everything. But if you think about it, if you only spend $30 on a knife, which this knife costs a little bit more than $30, but in theory, if you only spend $30 on a knife, there's only so much money that can be put into the making of the steel and into the heat treatment, into the grinding. So will you get the best version of D2 in a budget knife for $30? You will probably not get it. There are custom makers that build custom knives for $200, $400, $1,000, and those D2s will probably be better because there is more time that went into those knives than in a $30 budget knife. So I'm a little bit, I do understand why there are a lot of budget knives using D2 now, but if I buy a budget knife, it is because I want to do certain things with it and I want to abuse it. I have never had a problem with a budget knife using 8CR13 MOV, 12C27 and Aus 8. It really does not matter as much to me personally, but I do see people that do not have a lot of money to spend on knives, that they do also want to have a little bit of a variety and maybe get a steel that holds an edge a little bit longer. So I do understand why we have that trend going on, but it's not necessarily something that I need personally, but everybody's different, of course. Now, there is the question, which steels are really good to buy, which maker makes one steel the best. Like I said, Spyderco's S40V is not as good as Buck's S40V, but it's still fine to go. Spyderco's VG10 is not as good as SOG's or Kaiser's VG10. It's still good to go. So I would not necessarily base my buying decision on the steel alone, but on more things. Because maybe you like the design, maybe you like the handling of that knife a little bit more. I think there is, like I said, there is always a benefit with everything. You need to know what you like. Do you like a steel that's easier to maintain, or do you like a steel that's a little bit better in edge holding ultimately? But I do think the mainstream steels that we see now that everybody wants, like I said, M390, terrible steels for a wide audience because most people are not that good at resharpening their own knives and also using their own knives. So now the question arises, why do makers put out new steels every couple of years? Why do we always get those new steels on the market? Now that's very simple, because first, companies need to sell us the same stuff twice or want to sell us new stuff, and also we have the demand for it, and I think that's good. I think that pushes the industry always a little bit and keeps us going if we have newer steels that come out. CPM S45, for instance, S45VN seems to become one of the new meta steels. Spyderco uses it, Hindra has already used it, and Chris Reeve is also going to use it. I also think this is not a good steel for a wide audience, but you know, there's always a shift. And like I said with S40V, before, people get better with heat treating over the time, the longer they use it. But I think it's great. I do like to buy knives in different steels, try them out, see what steels take a better edge, and which steel sharpens like that, and all that stuff. I don't really have a recommendation for you in terms of steel, which steels you should buy. I think you should buy I think you should buy the steels and the knives for the purpose you have for them. If you do break down a lot of boxes, you may want to go with a knife that has a little bit more edge retention. If you do go in the woods a lot and you spend time outside and you work on stuff where you need to cut harder material, you may want to have a steel that's a little bit more durable. So, like I said, there's always a trade-off, like with all things in life, I guess. Yeah. Also, there is always this discussion between people that say steel does matter and steel does not matter. I think there is a truth in both of those things. I recently had a discussion with both kinds of people. Like, a friend of mine told me he got this knife in M390, not this one, but a different knife in M390, and he was like, "This knife is so great. It uses M390. M390 is the best steel." And I was like, "Why do you think that is?" And he says, "Yeah, because it never gets dull." And I was like, "Well, if a knife does not get dull, that means you don't use it enough, because I can get M390 dull within a matter of a week if I want to, and if I use it a lot. But if you don't, and I'm not criticizing anybody here, but if you have 200 knives in your collection and you're constantly rotating, there is a very low chance for you to ever get a knife really dull. Doesn't matter the steel it is. It's not because the steel is so great or the knife is so great, it's because you don't use it enough." And also, I asked him, "Have you ever resharpened that knife because the geometry looks a little bit thick?" And he was like, "No, I have never resharpened it." Now, if you have resharpened a lot of M390 knives with thick geometry, you will absolutely hate that steel. So I encourage you to go out there and use your M390 knives and use them hard and resharpen that. Because if you don't use a knife and never resharpen it, there is no point in saying this is the best steel and this is the best blah 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 and blah blah blah. You need to get the experience and get the time behind that knife and get the time on the stones to actually make a statement like that. Now, on the other hand, so we have both extremes these days. We have the people that say M390 is the best knife. On the other hand, we have people that say, like, it doesn't matter the steel. Any steel is fine, which is also not true. This knife right here, it's 440 steel. Now, the steel actually doesn't matter, but the heat treatment is so crappy that this knife, it can't cut anything at all. But this is a 10 euro knife. I didn't expect anything from it. We also have good companies that use very simple steels very well, like Victorinox, for instance. They use a very simplified steel, but they use a good geometry, a good heat treatment on it, and then they get a lot of performance out of that steel for what it is. So they try to get the best performance out of that simple steel, which is a great concept in my opinion. We should use simpler steels and put more time into heat treatment than use more expensive steels and more complicated steels and put less time into heat treating them. So that's ultimately, I would say, is ultimately the goal. Also, people are constantly comparing price points. Like, they say, okay, the Recon 1 in S45 VN costs $100 or something like that. And then we have the Benzo 31 that also uses S45 VN, which is soon gonna be switched over to S45 VN. Doesn't matter right now, it's S45 VN, and costs 3-4 times as much as the Recon 1. Now, those steels are different. Cold Steel uses a different treatment on the S45 VN, and I do believe Chris Reeves' S45 VN is way better in terms of how it sharpens, how its ability to hold an edge and everything. But on the other hand, this is still not a bad knife by any means, because the way I use this Recon 1 is something that I would never do with this knife. And I am happy that the steel is not as hard and tends to roll over a little bit easier, because I can maintain it and I can hard use this knife. And actually, for me, for how I use this knife, it wouldn't matter if it would be S45 VN, AUS 8, it really wouldn't matter. But in other knives, it actually does matter which steel it is. Also, the last thing I want to mention is the edges that you get out of box, the way a knife comes to you, the edge is never gonna be as good as it can potentially be. If you get a new knife, usually you only get 1/3 of the performance out of it that you would get if you would resharpen it yourself, and if you would resharpen it well. Means the edges on most, there is a lot of this discussion in the knife community right now. People talk about burnt edges and manufacturers ruining their edge as they grind them, overheating them basically. I've also seen a lot more of the buffed edges. They are dulled down on the buffing wheel because people press too hard on the buffing wheel. Those are things that, in my opinion, happen more often even than burnt edges. But there is for sure there are things happening like this happening, that people overheat the edges as they're sharpening it. But yeah, which is why I would encourage you to learn resharpening and resharpen your knives better. Because if you resharpen your knives better, you get more performance out of it. It doesn't matter which steel it is. If your edges are better, you're gonna get more performance out of it. Which is why I would say invest into sharpening more than invest time into looking which knife uses which steel and at which price point it comes in and blah blah blah. Buy a knife for the knife and not for the steel, unless you're a nerd like me and like to try out different steels. But for the most part, I buy knives because I like the knife itself, and I don't really care about the steel too much. And I think that's where we should be, because we are so picky these days when it comes to very simple things, or very, I don't know, not simple things, but when it comes to things like that are not that important in the end. So that was my take on steels, and like I said in the beginning, we barely even scratched the surface, which with this video, it's very hard to do in a timely manner, and I think if you don't understand the fundamentals, you cannot talk about the more deeper stuff. So, I don't know, maybe I will talk about steels more in the future, who knows. Yeah, I hope you guys liked the video. If you look at the Sebenza, man. So beautiful, it's so beautiful. If you like this video, you can leave a like, or you cannot leave a like. I don't care. Yeah. Anything else I want to mention? I don't even know. I will stop it right here. Hold on a second. I need my counterpoint. So, end of the video. Wish you guys have a nice rest of your day. If you don't, then still try to see the good in life. I don't know what the fuck I'm talking. Goodbye, people. See ya.